And now, the Lowe Post.
Welcome to the Lowe Post podcast on a busy NBA Wednesday. And one of my favorite things to do is highlight the great work of a lot of my colleagues by bringing them on after they drop a massive story that a lot of work went into. And that is doubly fun when the someone in question is the great Kevin Arnovitz, and triply fun when the story features a goat and or multiple goats defecating in the office of the Phoenix Suns general manager, Kevin Arnovitz. How are you?
I'm doing very well. How are you?
Good. I'm going to send you like a goat. Has anyone already sent you goat emails or goat memes? Maybe I'll send you like a stuffed goat or something to commemorate this.
Baby goats are really funny. If you ever watch them on, I am a connoisseur of the baby animal video subgenre. I confess.
Wow.
I follow nothing but golden retriever puppies on Instagram. I am essentially a 61-year-old secretary in your office who has the kitten calendar. That's who I am.
Hang in there.
Spiritually.
Hang in there.
Hang in there with a little kitten. Yes, absolutely.
The one thing I need to know is if Ryan McDonough's office was carpeted, because goat defecation it's bad. It's a bad sign for your organization if animals are defecating anywhere. Even the bats in San Antonio are starting to become problematic. I'm not saying they're defecating. I'm just saying the fifth time a bat delays a game, it's not really even fun anymore. It's more like, why is this happening? So anytime a farm animal is defecating in your organization's offices, it's bad. But it's different if it's a carpeted office. And I now need to know if it's carpeted, because that's like multiple days worth of problems you got. If it's a floor, if it's a tile floor, it's a kind of a quick cleanup job. That's all I'm saying.
You give me some time for a follow-up. I don't know if it's linoleum or that nice fake wood they have now that kind of looks like wood, but is more resilient. I do not know. This is a failure of reportage on my part. I need to get to the bottom of it. I will get back to you on the surface of the floor in Ryan McDonough's old office. It's
a much less funny version of the what flavor soup. Soups don't come in flavors. What kind of soup did J.R. Smith throw at Damon Jones? The chicken tortilla being the answer, but there was a few hours where that was like more pressing than where is LeBron James going to sign on July 1st. The goat surface is not that pressing. So what we are talking about, in case anyone missed it, is Kevin Arnovitz. I think these are the best stories to me, and they're my favorite ones to write. And I was very jealous of this one, but happy that you wrote it, which is the entire NBA is just not even looking at this franchise anymore. Like, it's just, no one's watching it. There's like 100 Phoenix Suns fans who tweet the timeline every time they play, and it's very, they're very hardcore, and I respect them. I respect NBA hardcore fans. I am one. But the NBA at large has just turned away from Phoenix, and what you did is just say, hey, wait a second. This franchise until the last 7 years was, arguably the most successful franchise never to won a championship. They make the playoffs all the time. They win 50 wins all the time. They're 7 seconds or less. They are innovative. They are a market that can draw players. They're a place that people want to play. What the hell happened? And you just went and kind of essentially asked that question. Is the origin of the story just that curiosity? Like, wait a second, what's happening here?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question. So how do you go from being one of the NBA's thought leaders as an organization, right? Like, it wasn't just they innovated offense. I mean, so much of what people like about the NBA can be, at least intellectually, traced back to ideas they were implemented, in Phoenix 12, 15 years ago. To say nothing of like player health. Remember, this was the fountain of youth. This is where you went if you were Grant Hill or a star who might have suffered some injury problems, and then you sort of can restore a career, or take a guy like Steve Nash, who by any other account should be really brittle, and then can just sort of thrive and flourish there and stay healthy, and then you become this, frankly, a laughing stock. 9 straight years now without the playoffs. They're going to lose 25 games or win fewer than 25 games for the 4th straight season. And so why? And I think the origins are really interesting. When Robert Sarver bought this team, it was on the heels of, I believe it was a 28 or 29 win season. The organization was sort of in financial distress. Sarver paid what at the time seemed hilarious, $403 million, half of it in debt. And he comes in, first thing is to get on the plane and go recruit Steve Nash with Brian Colangelo and and Mike D'Antoni and David Griffin, and then ultimately this is a team that jumps in a win total from 28 to 60, was it 61 or 62?
62 and 20.
You're a genius, right? I mean, here you are, you come in, you buy this team, you empower these people, they come up with this great blueprint. You are like, not only are you winning games, you are the best show on wood. I mean, you are, Zach, you remember what it was like watching Suns basketball as a basketball fan in the mid-2000s. It was like, holy crap. It wasn't just like, oh, they're good. It is, I mean, this was a revelation. I mean,
it was like aliens had landed on Earth and started playing basketball in a different way than anyone imagined was possible.
And you've got a front row seat. You're on the sidelines for this, and it's your doing. At least that's you've got that thought, and why not? You've succeeded in this other field. You're a tremendous real estate investor. It's how you afforded the team, and so for the next several years, clearly your ownership was the variable. What changed in 2004? Well, ownership, and so you start to believe possibly that I've got a golden touch, and then what happens is over time you get a little cheap. This recession hits, and you start selling off draft picks, or you package 2 firsts to unload a bad deal. The Kurt Thomas thing, everything else, and slowly but surely, there's some clouds sort of move in, and then it just really starts to hit. You start paying for bad decisions. You start paying for bad taste in personnel, whether it's at the managerial level, whether it's at the coaching level. You want to be involved because you think you do have the requisite expertise. So, you start maybe hindering in some of the people you've charged to make decisions, and it gets messy. And little by little, your facility deteriorates. Like you have one of the worst setups in the league. You're losing games. You're drafting poorly. You're cycling through coaches and GMs. And it just starts compounding, and then that toxicity and that stench starts to appear, right? And this is how you fast forward 9 years, and you have otherwise well-meaning young players skipping out on not charity events, but on fan relation events, right? You have coaching staffs wondering, what the hell is going to happen here, and we don't really know what the story is. And one of the stories I sort of told in my story was, I was talking to an executive from another team, and it's like, we do this exercise every year where we want to kind of figure out the strategies of our other 29 rivals. And this is something front offices do, right? Like you sit around the conference table, you say, okay, let's define in one sentence sort of the persona and the objective of every one of our teams. The Atlanta Hawks. Hey, we're a team in asset management and player development. Philadelphia 76ers. We're the team that pushed all in into making an immediate championship drive. Los Angeles Clippers. Well, we're a team that's kind of pursuing multiple tracks simultaneously, trying to stay competitive while we sort of rebuild and pursue free agents. Then they get to the Phoenix Suns, and everyone sort of looks around and says, okay, what is it? Well, they just signed Trevor Ariza and brought in Ryan Anderson, Jamal Crawford. We hear our best intel is that they're making a playoff push. Well, wait a minute, but what about these young guys under the age of 23? Aren't they really a fundamentally young team? Well, and then sort of there's this, the way that the story is described to me by a couple people, everyone sort of like shrugged their shoulders, and they never came up with an answer for the Phoenix Suns. And well, it's I don't want to say that your inability for a rival front office to define your objective in one sentence is necessarily a damning thing, but it does say something, and that's just sort of where they're at. And it's just right now they have co-interim GMs. No one knows if those folks are kind of empowered for the long term. It appears they won't be. It appears somebody else will be coming in. That process has started now. But it's just sort of people inside the organization feel beleaguered. They don't know what the direction is. They don't know where to turn for leadership. People who've left just all have. It's rare to find anything. The most charitable thing people will say is, Robert Sarver is a very nice person when you get him away from this environment. He's been extremely generous interested in my family on a sincere level, is very generous with making sure my housing situation is taken care of, financial advice, just an extremely warm guy when you get him away from this sort of milieu. But that's about as nice as it gets. And it's just kind of a mess. And there's no end in sight other than, who knows, maybe they'll get Zion Williamson, because that's what the league does.
Yes, in chronicling the demise of the Suns in your story, the one common thread is Robert Sarver, and that's what you focused on and who you focused on. And I think that's the right choice. He is the one common thread. I find writing about owners among the more difficult things to do because in a lot of ways they're the easiest target. They're the top, so there's a buck stops here kind of thing. They're the easiest person to blame. And they're the people that we, and by we I mean people like me and you, reporters, deal with least often. And so it's easy for, and when the people we deal with most often, which are front office coaches, players, whatever, when they begin to feel a little tenuous, it's easy for them to blame the owner too. And the owner does set the culture of a team, right? That's something you hear over again. The culture starts at the top. The Spurs culture starts with Peter Holt taking a hands-off view of things and letting the Spurs Pop and RC run the show. And I do believe that's true, but sort of figuring out how that's true. What exactly does that mean for an owner to set the culture? If this owner is, if not a villain, then a cause of dysfunction or an agent of dysfunction, how? Are they around all the time? What other businesses do they have? And I think you went about answering that question very skillfully by getting all these specific, like Robert Sarver being, let's say interventionist in a way that is unpredictable and noisy and not healthy. But I wonder if you felt that tension that I feel sometimes writing about owners, which is, am I just picking the easiest target? Did you feel that at all?
Yeah, no, and I agree with you. One of the things the late Dan Fagan once told me was we were having a conversation, and I was actually I think doing one of these kinds of pieces, trying to get to the bottom of what plagues organization X, and agents are always interesting to people to talk to, and in fact. I've talked to a few agents for this story, and they had a very diverse set of opinions. Especially on the matter of James Jones, who has taken a lot of flack in sort of the rival executive and scouting community, and we can talk about that because it's very interesting. But I have one agent who said, no, actually, my dealings with James have been fantastic. But sort of asking, one thing Dan once said is, I was sort of saying, I was sort of defending in a devil's advocate sort of way a GM by saying, he wanted to make that acquisition or that trade, but his owner wouldn't let him. And this was pretty early. I'd been only covering the league for a couple of seasons. One thing Dan said that always stuck with me was, he said, no. That is the job of the GM. He's like, do you really think the job of the GM is to pick players and to make trades like it's fantasy basketball? No. Your job as a GM is to manage your owner. That's what good GMs do. He's like, when I hear a GM tell me, I want to get it done, but my damn owner won't let me, he's like, that is a GM I have absolutely zero respect for. That's a GM who can't do his job. Oh, so you conceive of the idea, but you can't bring it to fruition because you can't talk your owner or sell your owner into it. And I think that always stuck with me. And so I do think it's very easy to just lay everything on Robert Sarver because he does pick the personnel, and to the extent that his impulses are indulged or he feels like his impulses need to be indulged, he's at fault, and he is the one constant variable. But I do think, I don't think you can say, quote, let Ryan McDonough off the hook necessarily, right? Like, if Ryan had a failing, it was, however the high degree of difficulty it might be, you could argue that Ryan failed to manage the expectations of his owner or do what was necessary to sort of placate the owner to the point where he was freed up to make whatever decisions you make. Now, one of the hardest things in Phoenix is to figure out that bad move or that bad draft pick or that bad trade or that bad point guard situation. Was it the fault of, Robert Sarver inserting himself in decision-making, or was it the fault of a front office who couldn't discern between, a good point guard or a bad, or who you keep, or how to manage Eric Bledsoe's expectations or mood or whatever it was. So it's a very hard thing to do, and I'm with you. I think it's very easy to look at the goofy owner on the sideline heckling Matt Barnes and say, oh, that guy is a clown. I always think it's more complicated than that, and I do think in Phoenix it is more complicated than that. Yes, everyone has a Robert Sarver story, but I think ultimately he is to quote blame because he does pick these people, and I think you now have a body of evidence that suggests that they can't all be idiots. Like they're all idiots, and if they are, who's picking the idiots? I don't think they are all idiots, but I do think that there's one constant variable. They're not all idiots, right? Like I'm saying that's the point. And but I also think it is incumbent on, yes, some owners are harder to manage than others, but I think some of the most successful general managers in our league, in the league we cover, are because are people who are able to manage the expectations of rich, eccentric impulsive, know-it-all billionaires. And that is the skill for a president of basketball operations that above all. Now, it's easier for Masai Ujiri in Toronto, who has a very reasonable ownership situation, than it is for, say, whoever's in charge in Phoenix, or for that matter in New York, or
Cleveland.
Cleveland, good one. But that's the job. The job is, your owner's crazy or impulsive or nutty or thinks he knows everything.
Leave all those adjectives aside. When you get into the draft room and you have an owner whoever your owner is, there's one team I'm thinking of that I won't name the team. You get into the draft room and you have a decision, and it's a big decision. It's a decision that's going to chart the course for your franchise, or at least chart part of it for the next 4 or 5 years. Your owner might know something about basketball. Your owner has been in basketball for a long time. But in that moment, he doesn't know as much as you, the general manager, about the draft prospects that are at hand, about the valuation of first-round picks vis-a-vis the current cap environment and all that, and about the veteran player that maybe is on the other end of this trade or something like whatever the scenario is, right? He doesn't know as much because for a lot of the owners, 25 of the 30 owners, the NBA is only part of their job. It's your entire job. This moment is your entire job. And that's the moment where if the owner, and I'm thinking of one team in particular, the owner wants to do one thing, the front office wants to do another, but no one in that front office has the gravitas to stand up in that moment and say, no, we're not doing that. This is what we're going to do. And getting to that moment, having a GM who's up to that moment, is dependent on so many variables, not the least of which, like, the GM has to have a certain gravitas, and sometimes gravitas comes from who you are. Danny Ainge walks in the door as a Celtic legend with that kind of gravitas. Some of it comes with experience, but you maybe can't manufacture experience. If it's year 2 in your GM career, it's just year 2. You can't fake that it's year 20. And sometimes the activist owner who knows a lot about basketball and wants to make a lot of decisions is intentionally not going to hire somebody with the gravitas or the social skills or whatever to stand up to them in that moment. It's hard to find the sweet spot of owner GM relations. I think a few teams have found it, and we could name them, but there are a lot. It's a complex algorithm.
It is, and look, Robert Sarver in the story says, in my other business, I've been very successful sort of finding young managerial talent and cultivating it, and empowering it. It's harder to do that here. Now, I think you could argue, I think Sarver's being candid, and you have to at least appreciate that he's owning up to it. Now, is it because you haven't fully empowered them or divested of the decision making and letting them do their job? Sam Presti's such an interesting example. If ever there was a guy who was 30 and looked 18 and took this job, I think you and I would say, and I think most of the league would say, when you talk about the gravitas power rankings among the 30 lead basketball executives, Presti's probably he got to be top 5. Yet, in many ways, you could argue that he came up through a very, Ryan McDonough pedigree, right? He was a guy with a sterling organization who had the endorsement of one of those true gravitas people, right? Danny Ainge, Greg Popovich, whatever, R.C. Buford, but ultimately kind of cultivated that gravitas, and I think largely because he just naturally have it. He's a serious person who knows how to articulate serious issues in a serious way. And part of it was he might have had an ownership group that was interested in sort of empowering him in that way, not just saying, "Hey, we want to cultivate young talent, a young managerial talent, and make him one of these luminaries." But we're also going to let him do the job. In Phoenix, it's very tricky, and their current situation I think is fascinating. It was actually really interesting to kind of talk to. So James Jones is now, Trevor Buckstein is sort of the interim co-GMs, which in and of itself I think is hard because interim is just one of those tags that who in the organization knows how to? Are you going to be the boss long term?
Yeah, if you're interim and co, that seems fraught. Like the interim co anything seems like a fraught place to be.
Yeah. Now, part of it is the timing of the fire of McDonough was so was unusual in that it doesn't really allow for you to sort of, if you're going to overhaul the front office, October and November is a very hard time.
Well, let's stop there. Let's talk about that. Why did they do that?
the point guard situation, I think when they came out of the gate in the preseason, it looked awful. And I mean, I know we don't put much into preseason ball, but when you're an owner sitting there on the sideline watching this just absolute travesty, Shaquille Harrison is your starting point guard. Finding a point guard kind of solidifying the point guard situation was one of the top imperatives of the organization going into the summer, and that was your charge. And then you're an owner and you're on the sidelines and you're just watching this debacle. Like, wait, how did we go from this point guard logjam we used to talk about in Phoenix to this situation where literally you have a non-NBA starting, and I don't want to put it on Harrison, I don't think he's the entire story, but he's sort of a metaphor of
tenacious defender, by the way. That dude is a monster on defense. Can't really do much on the other end, but he's going to be, I think, a good NBA backup.
Exactly, absolutely, and this is not to denigrate him. I mean, works his tail off. I mean, absolutely an overachiever. But sort of, wait a minute, wasn't that the whole objective of the last 5 months? Was to get to a point where we turned on the lights in October, and we had a point guard situation that was at least settled for the time being, and it didn't. And I think that was the last straw. Was just this sheer, and you could argue, hey, that's impulsive. That's impulsive. What, you don't like the first 2.5 preseason games, and you're just going to completely overhaul the front office of a GM that you extended less than essentially 15 months ago, and that's the answer.
There's always been a missing puzzle piece to me. Well, I mean, obviously they lost the first 3 games that year, but last season by 92 points combined. There's always been like a little missing puzzle piece to me of like, is that really all it was? Starting 0-3 in that fashion, bam, you fire the coach. Like something was off there, and you get into the possibility that Earl may have been a Sarver move more than a McDonough move, but like the timing of that was curious too. Did anything of that come up?
There's a lot. The Earl Watson situation is kind of a Rashomon, and I think there are probably 10,000 words that can be done on Watson, who also was at the time rep by Rich Paul, who also represented Bledsoe, and sort of that entire situation. It was almost one of those things when you're writing where, oh God, that's for the book that 11 people would read on the Phoenix Suns of this era, right? Like, I mean, I just think there's a certain point where you just can't get into everything, and they're so, then the stories get very competing, and kind of reporting it out, in a story that's already too long would just be in really getting into the weeds. But yeah, there's a lot there. I mean, in some ways, Watson was, it personified, I think Sarver's love of kind of former players who project a certain confidence, and Watson was very adept at sort of the language of culture, and I think early on a lot of the guys in the locker room really responded to him. But there was, he was also a coach who was very inexperienced. I mean, literally been a D-League assistant with the Toros. He then, joined the bench and then was, elevated to a head coach. To what extent, who is, quote, to blame, to the extent you want to blame anybody for Watson, or that's also a matter of really Rashomon great debate. That is the hardest thing is, and I'm sure you find this in your reporting, it's interesting how good decisions tend to have, bad decisions are orphans and good decisions have many fathers. And that's never been more true than in the NBA. But yeah, there's a lot there with, the Watson stuff. It's convoluted, and it was a certain point where it was like you start chasing all kinds of things.
Well, I do think it is interesting and notable that at the time Earl Watson was represented by Clutch Sports, and so was Eric Bledsoe. Yeah. I think that was interesting and notable, and at the very least caused a little bit of confusion and awkwardness for the team.
I think at the very most, a lot of confusion and awkwardness.
Yes.
At the time, and was and also was sort of a bloody shirt. When things got bad, where there was even speculation that perhaps it was just fundamentally not allowed under NBA rules for an agent to represent both a coach and a player. I think Clutch would say the same agent did not represent both. The agency did, and it was publicly reported that the agency represented Earl. Let's just zoom out. Let's zoom out, because they really have had a fascinating 4 to 5 NBA years.
So 2013-14, Ryan McDonough gets there. They trade Gortat for a first-round pick, and they want to tank. That is their goal. They want to tank. They accidentally win 48 games under Jeff Hornacek. The next year, they win 39 games. And in the middle of that season is the 2015 trade deadline where they trade Dragic to the Heat for 2 first-round picks, and they trade Isaiah to the Celtics for a bad first-round pick. And then that summer, they signed Tyson Chandler and tried to sign LaMarcus Aldridge. And since then, the organization has been 23 wins, 24 wins, 21 wins, and whatever they end up this year. And we haven't even talked about the draft picks, which range from Devin Booker to the same draft. I believe it's the 2017 NBA draft where they picked Bender and Chris, or maybe 2016. I don't remember. It's 2016, Bender and Chris. Alex Len a couple years before that. They had such wild swings to go from that 48 win season to here. I'm just curious. You've just dove into this for God knows how long in terms of reporting it and thinking about the Suns. Like, what stands out to you from that as a moment, as a pivot point, as an interesting move, as a what if? Like, when you reflect on all of that and zoom out and look at it like it's the wall with the like Sopranos family chart on it, connecting all the dots. Like, what's interesting to you?
What's interesting to me is when you start actually cataloging the draft picks. I mean, God, there were some real misses and some underachievers. But, I look at this team and it's like you play the game, Zach, of who would you trade a roster with going forward, right? And it's like they have some really good players all under the age of like 23 and under. I mean, there would be a lot. There are a lot of teams that I think would say, hey, if you brought it into our organization with our architecture, managerially and otherwise, and our coaching staff and our culture, we'd gladly take Booker, Ayton, Bridges, Jackson. I'm forgetting someone. Oh, yeah, T.J. Warren's a nice player, that like a top 5 pick pretty much guaranteed in this year's draft, a new facility on the way. Wow, what's so bad? Is this really? I mean, really, they're one good bounce away from the worm turning, right? I mean, that's like that's a very good little core that, I mean, pretty much 20 teams in the league who are not contending right now, would love to have for the next 5 to 7 years. And yet there's this kind of pigpen dust of dirt following around this franchise. And what is it? I mean, that was so interesting to me. As I was sort of writing, it's like, wait, are things that bad in Phoenix? Are things that bad in Phoenix? Yeah, you hear this crazy story from 2 years ago. Oh, the Earl Watson fiasco. Yeah, but that's in the rearview mirror. He said on a lot of the draft picks. Well, okay, through all that, they're still sitting with really good young talent. And, yeah, the coaching staff feels beleaguered and doesn't know what the plan is and, feels under fire and, but like that's what's so strange is we're not talking about a team that, yeah, they've struck out and Bender wasn't successful and Len is gone and wasn't successful. And, Jackson may have been a little bit of a reach at 4 in retrospect, though you talk to people around the league saying, hey, if we had drafted that guy, he'd be a boss now, and like, but it's not that bad.
People
right?
say that to you? About Josh Jackson? I find that the league is very low on Josh Jackson. And this actually is an interesting thing because if you, I wrote about this last week. If you contrast Mikal Bridges and Josh Jackson, I think most of the league would rather have Mikal Bridges, but Josh Jackson,
which is why I said Bridges in my early serialization of like what they have. Like I think Bridges.
Right. But it's so interesting.
Very high on Bridges.
It's so interesting because Josh Jackson, like Mikal Bridges can play 35 minutes and you barely notice him. But you barely notice him in a way that projects onto a good team because he can shoot threes and space the floor and he's got long arms and can play defense. Whereas Josh Jackson, whether you like him or you hate him, damn, you are going to notice him because he is going to take the ball and do absolutely crazy stuff with it. Floaters that make you think he's going to shoot a hole in the backboard, passes that don't go to the right person, the occasional fast break dunk, 1-on-2, and it actually kind of works out well because he's going crazy fast. And it just, I think, now I'm not saying Josh Jackson to me is among the more difficult young players in the league to project because he does so much stuff with the ball, but he's not good enough on a good team with the ball to have it, and he can't do anything off the ball because he can't shoot it all and nobody guards him. But I do think in this 3-and-D and floor spacing and role players and blah, blah, blah. We have all of us sort of started fetishizing Mikal Bridges at the expense of Josh Jackson, if you'll forgive me for sort of archetyping these guys. Like, Josh Jackson can do stuff with the ball that Mikal Bridges can't do. And that stuff is interesting. And just because it doesn't look good now and maybe doesn't project to how he'd play on a good team, I still think it's interesting. And I think the league has gotten it's like Dennis Smith. I think the league was like, oh, Dennis Smith just does dumb shit with the ball. We don't care. Like, well, maybe, like, let's see what he does. Let's see how he grows.
Well, and it was one of those conversations I'm sure you've had where, the exact, and again, it's one person's opinion and who cares. And, I'm not terribly high on Josh Jackson.
Neither am I, but I catch myself thinking, am I too low on him? Am I to become?
Well, that was their point. Their point was, and it's one of the great debates in basketball, right? Which is, is if a player is not succeeding as a young player on a team or in a locker room or inside a scheme, is it the failure of the player, or is it, that dumb organization that doesn't know how to develop players and just creates needless conflict, and there's the broken window theory in Phoenix, and it's just like everything's a mess. And if we had drafted that guy, was the point, he'd be just fine. We would have mitigated his weaknesses. We would have accentuated his strengths. We would have put him in positions to succeed. We would have provided him leadership and mentorship, and the influence of our veterans, and he'd be, he's ferocious. He wants to defend. He'd be a guy that would be a solid contributor on a program that is building. I mean, that was sort of the spirit in which the comment was made. Now, as you know as well as I do, it's very easy. It's a facile argument in many respects. It's very easy to look at a guy in a struggling organization and say, yeah, we drafted that guy. We would have known how to develop him, which is essentially the essence of it. I don't know if that's true. It's impossible. It's impossible to prove a negative in that respect.
I just think, anyway, I said my piece. The most interesting moment to me for the Suns over this span is that 2015 trade deadline, because the Dragic trade is an undisputed win for them. To get 2 first-round picks, including an unprotected Heat pick that, of course, is no longer theirs and is like 3 teams removed from them, is a home run for a guy who literally did not want to be there and had told them, I don't want to be here. They sold Lowe. And I forgot about the Brandon Knight trade, where they traded the Lakers pick, which was the crown jewel of the Steve Nash trade, for Brandon Knight. So I don't know how many of these balls were in the air at the same time, but it reminds me a little bit of all of the stuff the Pelicans did to microwave their team around AD, where the Drew Holiday trade is lumped in with a bunch of other moves that came after it that probably didn't work out. But Drew Holiday, for those 2 picks, that's a debate. You still get people who think those 2 picks, which was Noel and Elfrid Payton, I think, and could have been lots of other things, are still too much for Drew Holiday. And then there are people say, hold on, Drew Holiday was the belle of the ball a year ago when he was single-handedly or double-handedly with AD destroying the Blazers. And the people, Alvin Gentry's the best defender on the perimeter other than Kawhi Leonard. And it just made me think, what if you just stop there? What if you stop trading picks with the ones you traded for Drew Holiday and just build that team? And I think of the same thing with Phoenix. Like, what if you stopped after the Dragic trade? You just get those 2 picks. You keep IT. You keep the Lakers pick. Then you kind of are in the sweet spot where, as you put it before in reference to another team, you could be pretty good now and loaded for later. But maybe all of those discussions were simultaneous or contingent on each other. But I think about that Dragic trade as like, man, if I could have just put the brakes there and keep all that other stuff, or maybe sell high on IT later when it's clear that we've got, well, I mean, to a lot of us it was clear, but and not make that Knight trade, which I thought was like not insane at the time. I didn't like it, but I didn't think it was like absolutely insane. It turned out to be a disaster. And of course they traded back for that same Lakers pick 3 years later at the draft.
You probably don't trade for Knight, correct?
Say again?
Presumably. If you keep IT, you probably don't trade for Knight.
Yeah, exactly. So you don't know how many of these balls are in the air at the same time. I just think that's a very interesting moment.
Listeners, if you didn't already know, and I don't blame you, I'm out of touch, the NBA is wild, and Hulu has all the action. They've even partnered with guys like Joel Embiid and Damian Lillard, fringe MVP candidates, who are doing some pretty wild things for Hulu that you just have to check out. Now that Hulu has live sports, I wouldn't blame anybody for getting on board. If you've been late to Hulu, now's the time. A bunch of people are ditching their cable, and who can blame them when you can watch all the live games you want on Hulu Plus Live TV? It has the same channels as cable. For all you fogies like me, the same channels that you know. For only $45, watch your favorite teams and the biggest games all season long on Hulu Plus Live TV. Again, no cable required.
A couple other quick Suns things. Did you get into so Robert Sarver? You interview Robert Sarver, which I imagine was a wonderful, comfortable conversation. Yeah,
you know what?
He actually isn't. He's not bad to talk to.
He was delightful.
Yeah, he's not bad to talk to.
He was courteous. He was thoughtful. He was generous with his time, and he was polite. I mean, everyone. I think this thing happens, and I have this conversation with a coach we both know, who's just one of the more mild-mannered people. But when the lights go on, you walk through that tunnel for 2.5 hours. He's a maniac. And I once asked him, I'm like, I'm kind of fascinated with sort of what does the human brain do in those moments. I think Steve Kerr is a perfect example. One of the most gracious, silver-tongued, just thoughtful, empathetic people on earth. And then you get him in in those 2.5 hours, it's F-U, M-F-er, and clipboards being consigned to the cemetery of office supplies and everything else. And this coach said the interesting thing. He said, I don't know, we turn into a werewolf. He's like, I get back into the room sometimes, and I don't even remember the 2.5 hours. He's like, I'll remember sets or things I saw, impressions I had with my team, but like in terms of my own personal behavior, I don't even know what I said or how I communicated it. And I just think that owners are sort of like the adrenaline gets running, a draft room, the sideline, when you're sitting courtside at a game, after the game, just the on game night in general. And then you get away from that, and it's just like, but you're just a normal human being.
If you're an owner and you're going to yell at your own players and your own coaches and your own team, which is you wrote, he does. And there are 100 stories like that. I mean, when your story came out, the thing you heard from Phoenix people was, "Oh my God, there are even more he could have put in there." If you can't, then you just have to sit somewhere else. If you're an owner, watch the game. You can even heckle the refs a little bit. You can't be yelling at your own team. You shouldn't be yelling at the other team either. You probably shouldn't be yelling at the refs, but we're all going to yell at the refs. It's part of the deal.
But you paid $400 million.
That's fine. You're undermining it, and maybe you can't.
No, I know. I agree with you.
Anyway, I don't know what I was. Sarver says to you in the interview, he pushes back on the idea that he's making any decisions or overruling any decisions or that he's the hammer on any decisions and said, I would not overrule my basketball people. It's their decision. Obviously, I think you would get pushback on that from the basketball people.
Absolutely.
So my question to you is, did the decision to draft Ayton over Doncic come up at all in your reporting? Because Ayton is the University of Arizona. You know what the conspiracy theory is. He's nearby. He's a local product. The owner says we can't pass him up. He'll sell tickets, yada, yada. And meanwhile, you've just hired the coach of the Slovenian national team who knows Doncic better than literally anyone in the NBA other than maybe Goran Dragic. I would be fascinated to hear from all of now Igor Kokoshkov is too smart to talk to you about this because at length because he's a rookie head coach trying to make his way.
Yep.
I don't know what he wanted. I assume he wanted Doncic. I've talked to him about Doncic, the player, before he was drafted even. Did you get what was the impression you got about the making of that decision?
It's like every organization that I think was at the top of the draft. There was a sort of like imagine a Supreme Court with ideological differences. There were models in the organization that favored Luka by a mile. Actually, Robert Sarver and James Jones went to see Luka at the EuroLeague Final Four, so they evaluated him. But there was just, I think that
I didn't know that Sarver was at the EuroLeague Final.
Yeah,
I didn't know
with
that.
James Jones and. But there was I think there was a wide range of debate. By the way, as there was in Atlanta, as there was in Sacramento. I mean, I think people forget there's usually somewhere between half dozen, a dozen people sitting around that table for the better part of 2.5 months, going through their models, going through scenarios, and it's sort of like there is a range of opinion. And what's interesting about Phoenix is when they made all those firings, the criteria they used for the firings was among the scouts and sort of the managerial level was. They looked at the track record of their draft boards, and those with the highest ratings were kept, and those with the lower ratings were sacked, according to people inside the organization. But I think the Ayton thing was a collective decision based on lots of consensus. In my opinion, I don't think Sarver was the hammer on that decision.
Interesting.
I think it was collective.
Yeah,
But
I think
clearly,
Ryan McDonough has spoken highly of Ayton and owned that pick as much as Sarver. And by the way, I think Ayton, and you and I were on this months ago on this podcast. I think Ayton's having an underrated rookie season. We said it in, what is this, March? We probably said it in December or January on this podcast. You know, there's been Luka Mania and now there's Trey Mania, both well-deserved, having sensational seasons, going to finish 1-2 in Rookie of the Year. Luka's going to win and Trey will finish second, I think. I think Ayton probably has third by now, and because he is not the ball-dominant modern NBA superstar that those two guys fit archetypes, right? The big ball-handling wing and the little Steph Curry point guard. And because Ayton got off to, such a bad start defensively, first month of the season had absolutely no idea what was going on, people kind of flipped pretty quickly on that was a huge mistake. And look, it's not likely that DeAndre Ayton's going to be the best player from this draft. It's extremely unlikely. He's probably not going to be one of the 3 best or the 2 best. But he looks like a good NBA player, and the progress he's made defensively, like, he's not good, but he's not abjectly terrible. He's gotten a lot of publicity in the last couple of days for guarding Bron in part of the game that ended the Lakers season and protecting the rim really well. He's made the kind of progress defensively exactly as you would want from a rookie big man, from clueless to normal bad to normal sometimes looks okay but is mostly below average. Like, I think his rookie season is a huge, the concluding theme is huge optimism.
Yeah, he's had a nice year. I think it's one of those larger conversations about, and it's a different conversation for a different day. You and I could do 2 hours on this. Is the center a mercenary position at this point? Insofar as, is that where you're going to invest the bulk of your cap, where you want your quote stars to be, or is it a position that can easily be filled on an ad hoc basis relative to how much salary flexibility you have, what you need at that position? We need a guy who can sort of protect the rim for 27 minutes a night, and then we're going to go small anyway, and who cares if that's who we are? And whether or not, when you look at a range of dynamic talent in a draft like this one, whether you go with that guy or you go with somebody with, again, a Luka, a Trey, whether you want your sort of pick and roll point guard who can shoot, or you want your just unicorn from hell,
or you trade down.
Or you trade down, right? And I think that's sort of the question with Ayton. I don't think he's certainly not going to be a bust. It's just you're maybe swayed by the fact that we have a guy who needs the ball in his hands, blah blah blah. That's our superstar. We should, it's always nice to counterbalance with somebody up front who can do certain things. And yada yada yada.
I'd probably as optimistic as I am, I'd rather have Luka Doncic. I'd probably rather have Trae Young, although it's close. I think Bagley has surpassed Ayton to me in terms of just but suffered from some of the same. Well, he's a boring big man, early season buzz. No, he's not boring. He's pretty good.
I love Bagley, and Ayton's a nice player. It was a really interesting draft, and actually, it's a wonderful kind of year to have those arguments. Like, what, all things being equal, what skill set do you want at a premium going forward? And it's a really hard conversation, but and again, I think where you come down on that is where you are sort of in terms of your sort of where intellectually you see the game. And I'm just someone who's kind of come to believe that big men are, unless it's Karl Anthony Towns or something like that, it's a mercenary position. You'll fill it with the mid-level. You'll go get Brook Lopez and you'll be fine. You know what I mean? Like, that's, and I tend to kind of side with that. And it's not crap on Ayton, who's had a really, as you said, has progressed really nicely. It's just like, how do you see basketball teams in this era working, and where do you want? At the end of the day, you're really deciding on, we're going to give a third of our cap to this guy in 5 years. And like, who is that guy and what position and what skills does he account for? And it's just a larger conversation.
Well, the other relevant, you mentioned Towns, by the way, and again, everyone stopped paying attention to the Wolves after the Butler trade. Oh my God. Karl Anthony Towns is putting up like 35, 15, and 5, like
last night,
like regularly. The other, the well-rounded big man thing, I think Bagley sort of fits that mold a little bit more than Ayton did. And then there was something else she said, and I already forgot what I was going to say in response. Oh, the third of your cap thing. The player we haven't talked about at all. The when you draft them that high, you're effectively asking, am I ready in 5 years to commit 25, 30, whatever the percentage ends up being? Devin Booker is the guy whose name we haven't said, and they gave him the max. He's got the same contract as Karl Anthony Towns, actually, and got it almost a little bit later, or a little bit sooner, rather. He got it right away. Karl waited to sign his for a while. I think Towns maybe has some different language in it. I can't remember. But it's effectively the same contract. Where do you stand on the is Devin Booker good debate? Like, does he actually help you win basketball games?
I mean, I think it's really hard to know. And I think it's because, in fact, it's funny, where do you put this story in context? And I think the context, and I didn't get to it because it's not really what the story was about, is, we don't know because this organization is so, somewhat dysfunctional that is I don't think Devin Booker is the problem, but one of the problems with being this way and being just abject is you can't even really nourish and figure out where this guy is because he exists. He exists in a state of dysfunction in that context. I'm not articulating this well, but it's just like I think Devin Booker's really good. He's clearly got the it thing. He's competitive as hell. Yeah, the defense, we'll figure it out. But I also think that to the extent that we can't figure it out yet, it's a manifestation of just a team that isn't, rowing in the right direction as an organization. And then you start hearing his comments, and it's clear that he's being adversely affected by this stench. And where am I with Devin Booker? I think Devin Booker's really good. I have no idea if he's going to help you win basketball games because I think, frankly, things have gotten bad enough in Phoenix that I don't think there's any one player, no matter how dynamic or talented, can really do to change that right now. Until the organization sort of, finds itself, figures out its vision, finds its kind of leadership structure and what it means. And then I think we'll have a better idea of how does Devin Booker function in an organization that has a plan.
I'm bullish on Devin Booker.
Is that a cop-out?
No, I'm bullish on Devin Booker. I didn't mean winning in Phoenix. I just meant, is he a winning player, period, or is he an empty calories player? Is he closer to what we conceive of Zach LaVine as being, or is he closer to what we conceive of Klay Thompson as being? Obviously he's miles away from Klay Thompson defensively.
I like that. I like that continuum.
Yeah, that's like sort of your shooting guard. Do they help you win continuum? And I'm not saying I'm giving up on Zach LaVine as a winning player, not if he gets to the rim for a huge percentage of shot attempts as he did this season, but yes, until he has any kind of clue what's happening on defense. I'm bullish that Devin Booker falls somewhere at least in the middle of that continuum. I think he can be a winning player, even taking up that percentage at the cap. But as you said, the situation has been so dysfunctional that who can know. Let's change the subject as we wrap up here. You guys just posted a 5-on-5 about the Lakers, and it's a topic. It's a topic I've been thinking a lot about because I want to write something about it, and I can't quite conceive of what quite yet. And one of the 5-on-5 questions is the one that I've been thinking about, and it was, does missing the playoffs affect LeBron's legacy at all or tarnish his legacy at all? And the answers were pretty emphatically no. And the question I pose to you, Kevin Arnovitz, is it not at least a little interesting that in his first year in the Western Conference, the real conference, the varsity conference, LeBron is going to miss the playoffs? Now, I say that, look, all the confounding factors, right? He got injured, and if he's not injured, they make the playoffs. Easy, done, bam. The front office did a terrible job building a team around him, as some of us wrote in July as it was happening, that these signings made no sense. Lonzo has been injured. Tyson Chandler's been injured, so it's not just LeBron that's been injured. But is it still just not, is it not interesting to you at all that he moves to the West and he's going to the lottery? Is that cheap?
I think it's very interesting.
It's interesting to me. Tell me why you think it's interesting.
Well, I mean, I think it's interesting on a number of levels. I mean, I still believe it doesn't really affect. No one's going to look back in 30 years. I mean, if these end up being his Washington Wizards years, so be it. Then they came earlier than possible. He's also in his 16th season, and I think there was always going to be a moment where, by the sheer force of nature, LeBron is still not impervious to the factors of age. And there's going to be a moment when LeBron, who could always drag a team by the scruff of its neck to the playoffs, would no longer be able to do so sheerly based on his body of work for one season. Now, the injuries, I think, are part of that, right? Like, I mean, does he have that injury 4 years ago? No, it's something that comes with age. Your body becomes more brittle. Everything, morning ceases to be a pain-free event in your life. It's just you're always hurting. Everything takes longer to recover. And even if you do have the injury, but I just think that, I think it is interesting. And I also think, and again, I don't want to pivot the conversation away from LeBron necessarily, because I do think he brought with him, with all the things he does bring to an organization, he brings a level of chaos that I think can work as positive nervous energy and can work as negative nervous energy. But Zach, if I can just for a second, Jeannie Buss over the weekend at Sloan said, that it was fake news is the thing that the media is her biggest challenge as an organization. And I just thought that was just so very interesting to me, because this isn't about, I'm not going to be like a media person defending media. I don't really care if Jeannie Buss besmirches the craft of journalism, with something as hollow as fake news. But it's really about Jeannie Buss and the Lakers living in a state of willful ignorance of their shortcomings as an NBA franchise. And this is a franchise that has LeBron, right? Has the most generational talent, the biggest generational talent we've seen in years. And who chose you not because you're a well-run organization, because you're the Lakers, with all the mystique that comes with it, even when you don't win. They play in the most appealing market in the country. They have a multi-billion-dollar local broadcast deal. They have gotten the number 2 pick 3 of the last 4 years. Does he really believe that the media is the Lakers' biggest challenge? Bigger than leadership or accountability? Maybe it's time to address that stuff. Maybe it's time to realize that, having leadership and accountability is more than having Rob Pelinka quote Paulo Coelho at his press conference. With the Lakers, it always seems to be about the brand, and it never seems to be about the product. And I just when are we going to look at this? When is someone going to do the Suns piece on the Lakers? And just an absolute thing. When is someone going to say, wait, how is it that D'Angelo Russell's now an all-star? How is it that Julius Randle's averaging 29 and 3? How is it that Brooke Lopez is the missing piece? How is it that, Paul George, is somewhere else as an MVP and Depoy candidate?
Depoy? I like Depoy.
Depoy, Defensive Player of the Year. At what point do we look at this organization and say, do these people have any idea what they're doing? The way we ask about Phoenix, the way we ask about New York, the way we ask about, Sacramento at times, prior to this year when they've sort of gotten their act together. And it's just, because we're so seduced by the drama and LeBron and everything else and his legacy that no one can, who's paying attention, can just plainly see, why does this front office and ownership group deflect accountability, deflect, the track record, when it's just so, they're missing the playoffs with LeBron. Yes, I know he was injured. How is that even possible? The playoffs, not missing a top 4 seed, missing the playoffs to a team in the Clippers who need a freaking program just to figure out who everybody is in the locker room, because they've changed their teams every 3 or 4 years and they're still 5 games up. It's kind of hilarious, except that it's not. And I just can't divorce the LeBron question from the Laker question.
No, you can't.
Why did you choose this team?
You can't. So it's interesting. The Russell and Randall things is they've become things, capital T things, and that crescendoed when D'Angelo Russell, I think, deservedly made the All-Star team in the East. That hasn't bothered me as much as some other stuff, namely because I wrote at the time, it's strange to me that you would rather have Rajon Rondo than Julius Randle. It was effectively the same salary. I'd rather have Julius Randle. I've been living on Julius Randle Hill making fire for 4 years when it was empty. But I actually haven't been that impressed by Julius Randle's season either last year or this year in terms of its impact on winning. And Russell, I just don't recall anyone being aghast that the Lakers traded him. I just don't. And so the Nets have done a great job developing him. He doesn't look appreciably different to me as a player than he did 2 years ago. I always kind of liked him. You can go back and look at it in my writing. I was always a little bullish on him. But he never got to the line and still doesn't. He was a bad defender and still is below average. But he sees the floor well. I've always liked his passing and his vision. And this year, he's just making shots. Like those mid-rangers, the floaters, the things that like the whole game is supposed to not be about those shots anymore. He is making them at an astonishing rate and making pull-up threes. But I just don't remember anyone, even last season, his first season with the Nets, I don't remember anyone caring that they had traded D'Angelo Russell.
I take your point about hindsight. I really do. But at a certain point, like that's what separates sort of the transcendent front offices and organizations from the bad ones, is they see stuff that the median person or somebody, or even median like close watching journalist doesn't see.
Well, what you should see for
look at Danny Green and say, oh, this guy could be the cornerstone of a championship wing tandem for the next 8 years. And I'm not trying to fetishize the Spurs.
No.
Issues. I'm just saying, like all I'm saying is they failed. They have failed. They have every advantage as an organization. They are the kid who was born on third base. And they have failed. They have failed with LeBron. They have failed without LeBron. They have failed with draft picks. They have failed with a largesse of revenue that teams dream of. They get more for their purple versus gold game on Spectrum Sportsnet than most teams do for a regular season game. They have every, and she's sitting up there talking about, oh, the media is our biggest challenge. Fake news. It's something as hollow and as ridiculous as that trope.
No.
Maybe the fact that she would say that demonstrates the willful ignorance. The fact that you wouldn't even do what Robert Sarver does, which is go on the record and say, we're terrible. It's partially my fault. I've had bad taste in managerial personnel, whether that's true or not. Or I've underrated experience. This is a person who actually goes into a room with intelligent people and says the media is the biggest problem for the Lakers. The media, as if she hasn't been an anonymous source a zillion times on stories, as if she hasn't worked the media herself as much as any owner in the league outside of a couple that we can name. It's just, and I'm not saying this as a defender of the media. It's just when they just never hold themselves to account, and it's just, and no one will. Is anyone really saying it?
Well, even if you can't see what D'Angelo Russell might become, and I'm, even as someone who was mildly optimistic about him, I'm surprised at what he's become right now in 2019 for the Brooklyn Nets. I can't claim to have had that foresight. Even if you can't see. I
certainly did not myself, and I'm not an NBA GM, though.
And I was on Julius Randle Hill, and I'm weirdly kind of not as enthusiastic, even though his numbers and everything have ticked up. Even if you can't see those things, you must be able to see that Rajon Rondo, Lance Stevenson, and Michael Beasley, and on, are terrible fits with LeBron. And I'll never forget where I was when I read the Brian Windhorst, Ramona Shelburne story about how LeBron and the front office and whoever had sat down and said, this is the kind of team we're going to design with playmakers, and LeBron doesn't want to make a lot of plays, and we'll figure out the lack of shooting, and being like, these guys have no clue. And I wrote, these guys have no clue. These guys are terrible fits with LeBron. And the Brook Lopez, Michael Beasley thing, I've said it a million times, it's the single most inexplicable flip-flop of similar salary players in the league. And when I had Brook on my podcast 2 months ago in Milwaukee, I asked him, and I followed up a couple times, I essentially asked him, would you have stayed with the Lakers? Did you want to stay with the Lakers? And I pressed him because I had heard rumblings that maybe he didn't want to be a part of the circus once LeBron was coming there. And if that were the case, that kind of exonerates the Lakers. And so the reason I pressed him a little bit, and I even hinted at, I think I even may have said the word circus when I asked him the question, was because I had heard those rumblings and I wanted to see if they were true. And he kind of tepidly went the other way and said, no, I would have considered it. I would have been happy to go back. So I'm not sure what the truth is. But if you can't see that those players are bad fits with LeBron, then I don't know what you've been watching. Or maybe it's LeBron. It's signed that LeBron is going to be a bad team builder when it becomes his turn to do it. That's what you should see. Not seeing D'Angelo Russell popping this early, fine. Or wanting Lonzo Ball instead, or having Lonzo Ball instead and saying we don't need this other guy, let's use him to dump salary. Fine, get it. I'm not going to be that up in arms about it. It's the other stuff, designing a team that does not fit the guy you just signed, whether it's with his tacit permission, his explicit permission, his explicit suggestions, whatever it is that team just doesn't make sense. And then you go trade for shooting at the last minute in Reggie Bullock and Mike Muscala and give up Ivica Zubac, who's actually a useful center in the process. That doesn't make any sense to me. Now, back to LeBron, because everything comes back to LeBron. When I ask you, do you think it's interesting that in the Western Conference, he misses the playoffs for the first time? Does it matter? What I'm really asking is, does it matter for his case as the greatest player ever? And I don't know the answer to that question, because the other guy that's in that debate played his entire career in the Eastern Conference, and it was an inferior Eastern Conference even then. And the thing that his retirement, pre-Wizards, it encompassed the exact age range that LeBron is entering now. Michael retired at age 34 after his age 34 season and missed his age 35, 36, and 37 seasons, then came back, and we all kind of acknowledged that, like, the Wizard stuff doesn't count. Whether that's fair enough, it doesn't count. And so I don't know the answer to that question, but I do know that we're going to tout the 8 straight finals runs forever. It's one of the greatest streaks in the history of sports. It all happened in the East. And it all happened in an absolute, in particularly after Derrick Rose's injury, in an East that was awful. And once the Pacers went away, it was really awful. And I'm not sure what it means that he's changed conferences and gone to the real conference and missed the playoffs. And he didn't miss the playoffs. The Lakers did, and they did because he got hurt and because their roster makes no sense. I get all of it. I still, in my gut, feel that it means something. And it makes me uncomfortable because it makes me feel like I'm bloviating on TV about how LeBron has failed in the Western Conference, and that's not really what I'm saying. But in my gut, it means something that he moved to the West and didn't make the playoffs. I can't quite articulate why.
If it was his 13th season, maybe. I'm still, and I don't, listen, I mean, he holds some accountability. And look, it is possible. I mean, one thing we have to consider is that, you know, for his greatness, and he might be the greatest ever, is it hard to build a team around LeBron for intangible reasons, you know, that we stated? Like, are there acquisitions you can't make because he prefers to work in sort of, as he said, he likes to be uncomfortable. You know, this is sort of like he's a chaos candidate. And does that make it harder to design a team? Or for that matter, you need to surround him with shooters rather than other guys, so you're sort of limited on your menu. And not only shooters, but shooters of a certain temperament, because you have to be a, quote, certain way to play with LeBron. So, you know, guys that might be useful like Jay Crowder or whatever have become just completely just non-productive malcontents. And is LeBron holding responsibility for that? I don't know. Look, I'll say this. If this is a chronic thing with the Lakers and actually he's about to start a 4-year stint where they don't win a playoff series, I mean, I think there's your chance they'll get in the playoffs. But even let's say they strike out on all their acquisitions this summer and overpay Jimmy Butler or something and come back as the 7th seed, you know, in a really good conference and don't win in the first round. Like now do we start having a conversation? I don't know. I look at the first, I think 15 seasons. There's a certain point at which is everything else gravy this late in a guy's career. We forget that it is late in LeBron's career. I mean, 16 seasons, Zach. I mean, 16 seasons is pretty much I even think for some of the stars. I mean, how many did?
No, I don't. I don't know what to. Yeah. I just think the conference imbalance has been such a defining feature of his entire career through no fault of his. Not his fault that the conferences are so imbalanced. Not his fault that he was.
Blame him because the Dolans can't figure out how to build a team and I'm always nervous about us counting against guys sort of cosmic events that they have nothing to do with, like the fact that. It's weird that the nation's capital and the New York market collectively produce 3 crapola teams every single year. That's why is that conference weak? Because for whatever reason, there's just they can't generate good teams in the markets that should otherwise be succeeding. Is that LeBron's fault? I just have trouble. I have trouble doing that. I have trouble Derrick Rose, you know, career falling off being it's just hard for me to do that. It's hard for me to assign. Issue demerits to a guy for things he has nothing to do with.
Or that Gloria James gave birth to LeBron James in Ohio, and LeBron wanted to come home when he was a free agent. And also, his home team happened to win the lottery the year he came out of high school, and so he was drafted into the Eastern Conference. I just don't, I don't know what to do with that. But I don't, he's not going to make 8 straight finals in the West. That's not a thing that's going to happen. But I don't know if Michael makes 6 and 8 years or whatever it is in the West with his little interregnum there in the middle. I don't know if that's a thing either. We never got to see Michael Jordan switch conferences. And so maybe it's just a curiosity. Maybe that's all it is. But it's something I'm thinking about more than just an idle curiosity. It's interesting to me that they're not going to make the playoffs because there are other teams in the West who have hit adversity, maybe not as severe as losing their best player for 20 games or whatever LeBron ended up missing, and are still going to make the playoffs. Like Denver's hit a lot of adversity, Houston's hit a lot of adversity, and other on and on. The Spurs missed Kawhi all of last season and found a way to make the play. It's like it's happened.
Right. Here's a question for LeBron. He came over to the Western Conference fully knowing that the odds were going to be stacked against his continuing this streak, and quite possibly the odds stacked against him even making a conference final. If you gave LeBron truth serum and said, hey, so you're going from a situation you could probably, certainly, play on Memorial Day.
You could play lefty all season and make the conference finals.
Right. Like why do it? Like, why? And we know, this was a family move. It was a lifestyle move. Now, the red ass could argue, countered against LeBron, that he basically let go of the rope. He let go of the competitive rope. Right. This is not my argument. I'm saying, but I don't think it would be completely idiotic if you were one of these people who believe by sheerly putting himself in a situation where the menu of options is Lance Stevenson or Rajon Rondo or whatever, going to this organization that really hasn't proved its mettle in several years. You could argue it's not a championship organization right now. In a time when the Warriors are almost a shoo-in to get at least to a conference finals, where the Houston Rockets come back, this is where the conference is stacked. You're essentially consigning yourself to a long shot to make a conference finals. Do you count that against the guy because it demonstrates that he, just from a purely professional planning standpoint, isn't all that serious at this, or he's letting go of the rope? That would be the question.
Well, the same people would
an asinine one.
The same people would count it against him for joining up with Philly or ganging up in Miami or rigging the game. You know what I mean? If he goes to Houston with James Harden or something, it's the same people are going to say, well, so what is the in-between? Where is he supposed to go that is like the perfect in-between fit of good but not quite good enough? Like, is he supposed to go to the Kings this summer and make Sacramento the NBA? Is that I don't know what the answer is.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know. Where could he have gone where there wouldn't have been some sort of disclaimer, other than staying in Cleveland? My
only point is I don't think it's screaming talk show, bloviating radio hour to think it's interesting that LeBron is missing the playoffs in the West. I think it's a discussion that maybe doesn't take you to a final destination that says anything new or interesting about LeBron, but I think the journey to wherever you end is interesting.
But to close on that, I do think when you have that, I think it's even more interesting to say the best brand in sports, the Los Angeles Lakers, with the best star in sports, cannot make the top 9 in their conference, which to me is fascinating as a commentary on, it's a superstar league. It's a brand league. It's a buzz league. And just that combination is just, again, to me, it's almost, the Laker question is even more interesting.
And I was wrong. I said on this podcast multiple times, I don't believe you can build a conference with 8 teams better than LeBron's team. Well, they built one. It's the Western Conference this year. It happened. I didn't think it was going to happen, and I was wrong. And props to guys like Tim Bontemps who saw this coming and predicted the Lakers would miss the playoffs. And Kevin Pelton had them, I think, as a borderline team, and a lot of the analytics projections did, and I just didn't believe it. And they were right, and I was wrong. And here we are. And we got what, 5 more weeks of the regular season until the real games start, my friend. You gearing up?
I'm gearing up. It looks like I might be in Toronto. I'm not sure for certain, but excited about that. I just think the Eastern Conference already in the second round is going to be bananas.
It's going to be great.
This is great. For all of the imbalance, there's a nice kind of elite tier in the East this year. I mean, that I cannot wait for that second round in the East.
Just make sure you include
nothing like OKC and Houston and Golden State and Denver. I mean, like if that's it, or Portland gets it, can keep it together for the playoffs. Like, I mean, I think it'd be a really fun postseason.
Yeah, OKC's defense going one way, Houston's defense going the other, and don't forget to include the Pacers in your Eastern Conference discussion, even though the schedule is brutal the rest of the way. All right, Kevin Arnovitz had the piece inside the Phoenix Suns, messy and dysfunctional front office. Read that. Read everything Kevin writes, but read that because that's what we talked about today. Kevin, thank you so much for your time. Great work. I look forward to seeing you down the line.
Thanks for having me.
The Lowe Post is presented by Goodyear. Drive always discovers possibilities. Goodyear, more driven.